Morning, class, and welcome. It's our final week of class, and this week we'll be reading excerpts from a very interesting ethnography by Catherine Lynn Geurts called Culture and the Senses, right here. And we'll be looking at concepts in the introduction and also concepts in the section on cosmology, and in which metaphysics is also looked at. One of the things that I thought I could try to explain, it's a fascinating concept, both the way uh, um, Pierre Bourdieu describes it and the way it's utilized in phenomenological anthropology, is this notion of history becoming nature. And I think this is key to understanding a lot of how the presentation of what we might call um, religious experience and religious phenomenon is portrayed in this ethnography. Um, so when we take um, history and nature, probably the two ways of looking at those words hermeneutically. For history, I would include myth in the history as well. And so it's a particular history um, that expresses the values of the individuals that that have created that history. Um, and so don't necessarily exclude myth and then the values in myth from the history. Um, what what is meant by nature is in particularly the human body, right? So the human body is nature, and it's I mean the natural world is nature as well, but the particular emphasis of nature is the human body. And so the question becomes, how does history, um, the stories we tell about the past, that express value as well as what occurred, um, transform nature, which is the human body. And so this will um, be heavily dependent on what her theory of the senses is. And so at the beginning of in the introduction to the text, she talks about the um, mistake of utilizing the five sense model. She'll refer to the five sense model as both a folk um, theory of the senses and a folk ideology of the senses. And in part, what this means is it's just something that most people are taught early on. They're taught that we have five senses, and those senses are sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. And they may also be taught that those senses don't influence each other, right? So you can see something and you can hear something, but what you hear won't affect how you see what you see, and vice versa. Um, One may also be taught, or it may just be assumed, that the senses are pre-cultural, right? So culture won't influence uh, the way in which we experience the empirical world via the senses. And she wants to present evidence against those. And the model of the senses she uses instead is the sensorium, in which there's sort of a unified sensory apparatus in which the senses can influence each other, and in which habits and practices can form um, sense particular sensoriums. And she'll use the idea of habitus in the sense which Pierre Bourdieu uses it, um, in which you can embody knowledge and practices, and essentially uh, change the sensorium. And so she looks at particular practices in particular um, um, cultures and locations in which she feels or perhaps shows. I think she actually shows that sensoriums uh, can be changed such that individuals can have radically different sensory and in this sense empirical experiences. And then she will sort of document cases in which people experience phenomenon that would be I think you could argue that this phenomenon has religious aspects to it. And and so um, and so this is the way in which she utilizes uh, the uh, the idea of history becoming nature. From certain histories, um, expressions of value are apparent, and the expressions of value are instituted in rituals, in practices, in child rearing, in our ethics. And those practices, embodied over time, will produce unique sensoriums. And then when we encounter empirical experience, that empirical experience will be processed through the particular sensorium, and therefore you get a particular empirical experience as opposed to a empirical experience that would be universal. And this has interesting um, applications for both uh, epistemology and how we utilize and view empirical experience, as well as how empirical experience might relate to phenomenological experience. There seems to perhaps even be a collapsing of empirical experience into phenomenological experience, which would be quite interesting. And so this I hope this helps in understanding some of the material presented in this ethnography, the philosophical background, um, and some of the thinkers being relied upon. So one is Pierre Bourdieu, and she will utilize the idea of history becoming nature. The other is Marlou-Pontet, and this is the idea of the pre-objective, in which um, experience begins with the subject and ends in the object, and not the other way around. Many would argue that experience begins in the object, and then we receive the empirical experience from the object via the senses. But the opposite is being argued, that empirical experience begins in the subject and begins in the sensorium, and then the sensorium will, in a sense, produce the empirical experience, given that its particularity. And so these are two fascinating concepts, and it makes for a fascinating read and quite a profound ethnography, particularly in as it analyzes and presents experiences that have religious dimension. So I hope this helps in the with the reading. Uh, Email me or ask me on Canvas if you have any questions, and take care.